Let me give you one. It's been in the press enough that I'm assuring you I'm only talking about the things I've seen in the press. All right, so we're not going behind any green doors here. Jihadist websites. Okay, I hate them. Okay, you hate them. We can all agree that they're offensive. Now, having arrived at that conclusion, so what? Think of the policy debate that now evolves. We ought to take that site down. Well, unlike in physical space, when a site goes down in cyberspace, how long does it take to pop up somewhere else? And how many of these sites are there anyway? And how fast do they procreate? You know, it's not like putting a bridge in the water, you know, moving across North Africa in 1943 or 1944. Okay? Beyond that, remember, it's not just a video game. When you say, take the site down, you get that visually pleasing effect that it doesn't come up on your screen anymore. But something happened behind the screen. And I guess you should hope that the physical space that was affected is somewhere out there in the broad planet Earth. But there's a reasonable chance, if you're not careful, the physical thing that went pop to make the site went away is in Houston or some other place protected by that thing we call the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution. So the lack of boundaries in cyberspace, the ubiquity of cyber access makes this far more complicated than it seems when you say, we got to take that site down, it's showing videos of our soldiers being tortured or something like that. Okay? Finally, if you're looking for an internet attitude of our country, and it's still embryonic, but we're trying to develop it, the internet attitude is the one that Secretary Clinton was very forceful about in a speech she gave about 3 months ago, and it's something called internet freedom. Okay, so now think of this discussion in this small room. We ought to take out this site when your macro policy towards the net is freedom of traffic, freedom of expression. Do you see how this, you know, it's just not as simple as the physical world, and you make it worse when you pull physical world kind of attitudes and physical world patterns of thought into the room when you're trying to think about cyber. We are not the only ones thinking about cyber. The international community, and I know I'm going to leave some time for questions, so let me just end with some, again, embryonic thoughts as to where the international community is with regard to cyberspace. I participated in a Council on Foreign Relations study. A lot of ideas were shared. None of these are finalized, so don't take any of these to the bank, and certainly don't attribute them to CFR. I just mentioned CFR to kind of remind you that you got some really bright folks who are now asking the question, what constitutes international law in cyberspace? What constitutes the laws of armed conflict in cyberspace? And there's an interesting question I should have asked earlier. What set of laws do you vote on to be dominant in cyberspace? Okay? You got some choices here. I'm going to give them to you in a minute. Different aspects of national life have different legal systems on them. All right? So that, for example, the domestic stuff, you know, lying, cheating, stealing, thieving, comes under domestic law. Do you think domestic law should be our model for how the American government governs cyberspace? Or do you think we should use international law, which in this case would be the laws of armed conflict? Should that be the dominant model for governing our actions in cyber? Oh, or should we use espionage law? You know, which is based upon fewer documents, less law, and more accepted international practice. All right? Oh, in any event, back to the story. What are the folks thinking about for the cyber domain? Well, number one, they think it's really chaotic. And they think what we need to do, and they're very chary about going into negotiations and signing treaties. This is not what this is about. But is it possible to have adult conversations among adult nations? How do you define adult nations? Not the UN, okay? But maybe the G20, or maybe the G8, you know, people have something to lose. and you get them in a room, and you begin to think of some broad concepts. Like, for example, outside of actual physical attacks in declared conflicts, denial of service attacks are absolutely forbidden and are never allowed and are never excused. Okay? That kind of bleeds out of Georgia and Kyrgyzstan and Estonia. Okay? And they would certainly admit that if you're bombing a country, you can probably go ahead and try to deny them computer access. All right? But short of that, the thought is that is such an easily available weapon, such a crude device, that we ought to really, what's the right word? Stigmatize its use. That adult nations, people who really play in the international community, they don't do it, and here's the punchline, and they don't allow it to happen from their sovereign space. So that's one thought. There's some thought out there that there are some networks that are so sensitive that maybe we should just kind of hold hands, at least hum kumbaya, and agree that they're just off limits. Okay? One is power grids. Okay? Now, a power grid is, in certainly traditional military thought, a legitimate target of war under certain circumstances. Okay? So now, if you've taken power grid off the cyber batting order, you're saying you can still put Mark 82s and TLAMs on it, but you just can't take it down with a computer, which is kind of madness because Mark 82s are kind of definitive, and that's a one-way switch. That thing is gone. But the cyber attack is reversible. Okay? But their thought process is that the cyber attack just doesn't happen like that. You've got to do what we call IPB, intelligence preparation of the battle space. So you find yourself penetrating, not reflecting any real operations, but if you look at it in the abstract, if you want to have the ability to attack a nation's electric grid in time of war, you can't wait for in time of war to penetrate his electric grid. And so their thought was there's got to be some rules set up because electric grids are so sensitive. You just can't have 23 different services, intelligence services, hacking their way through the electric grid of countries A through N and think that everything's going to end up okay. So anyway, they're thinking, what kind of regime could we establish? The other sensitive network they're thinking about are financial networks. Okay? That the financial network is so fragile that overall finance is so dependent upon investor confidence that cyber penetration of any electrical grid, for whatever transient advantage it might create for the aggressor state, is so harmful to the international financial system that we should just all agree these are like chemical weapons. We're just not going to use them. Okay? Now, none of this is final. All right? And I bring it up only to suggest to you that these are the kinds of thoughts that are churning out there as we kind of come to grips with what does it really mean to conduct cyber war in this new domain? How should we really think about it? And what opportunities do we have now when everything's still malleable to perhaps get some things right for the long term in terms of human competition in this last, or at least next domain? Well, look, I'm afraid that I actually raised more questions than I asked. The mitigation in that is that's probably an accurate reflection of reality. There are a lot more questions out there right now than there are answers. I stand by for the cyber equivalent of Herman Kahn's masterful, monumental On Thermonuclear War, which kind of worked his way through all of the kinds of questions that I've been tossing out here this morning in one volume. But that took place in the late 50s, early 60s, after nuclear weapons had been around for about 15 years. In the meantime, threats and opportunities in this fifth domain abound. We need to have this debate. And I personally await your contributions to this debate that we must have. And with that, thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff.
Okay, we're gonna take some questions from the audience until we run out of time. So with that said, let's bring up the house lights a little bit so it's easier to see people's hands. And since we ask a lot of questions on this side of the room, today we'll start taking questions from that side of the room. So anybody over there have a question, raise your hand. And
there's some in here.
Okay. We've got a microphone. Where is it?
Here.
Okay, now we can see. Who's got the question? Okay.
So I think a fundamental question hasn't been answered yet, and maybe I'm just not reading between the lines, but are we in a cyber warfare situation? And if yes, what is going to be, when is the time going to come when public and private truly band together as partners to resolve the situation or help resolve the situation in combat this cyber warfare situation?
Yeah. You can say you're in cyber war, but you have to accept the subset of definitions. So you've got to accept that you believe it constitutes war down here in the espionage exploitation area of kind of the spectrum of conflict. So if you want to say it that way, I would, and then that'd be okay. But again, it's not in our own thinking. We don't think what it is we do when we do C&E to be an act of war. It is that normal espionage thing that's based upon long-standing international practice that routinely happens between and among states, and that's really the legal background for it. Your question generates one other thing I should have mentioned from the CFR group, because their theory was that if you get states to self-limit, if you get states to to limit what it is they do on the internet, state activity there is so pronounced that if states begin to not do some of the things that they are doing, you will lower the noise level on the net, and the truly malevolent activity that is not espionage but is destructive or criminal, the truly malevolent activity will become more visible and easier to prevent. So it's kind of a corollary to what you suggested.
Anybody over on this side of the room? Way back there?
Okay.
We'll send a runner down. Sorry you don't have any lights down there. It's the hangover section.
We made it. You started to talk about how you guys are trying to define sort of like cyber-type rules of engagement in a war. Does this mean that since it's so possible for like a 15-year-old script kiddie to do something in a foreign country that he could set off international conflict possibly because these rules have been defined and he crossed the boundary accidentally, that you'll start to come into taking away the anonymous access that we have on the net as it stands? And that's how you're going to police that, keep people from being able to do this internationally.
Yeah. I'm not quite there in my thinking, but you're reflecting a lot of what I'm thinking about. Right now, in many ways, the biggest obstacle of taking how we usually think about these things and importing it into how we think about it in the cyber world is the aspect of attribution. All right. So if re-engineering could be done to some extent that softens or eases the attribution problem, then much more of traditional thinking could be brought in to thinking about operations, defense, attack, exploitation in cyberspace. I thought you were going another place with your question, so let me just add the additional thought. One of the things that I'm seeing reflected now is that since the price of entry of this is so low and actors act, and they're not state or state-sponsored, or it's very difficult to us to prove they're state-sponsored, one of the thoughts that's kind of rattling around now is to just be uninterested in that distinction and to actually hold states responsible for activity emanating from their sovereign space. And that